All right, everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for the introduction. My name's Colette, and this is my presentation on what I call the shamanic neurotype, the case for the cross-cultural experience of a shamanic neurotype and the need for this integration of the cognitive, neurological, psychospiritual framework in this Western psychedelic renaissance. And when I think about the psychedelic renaissance that we're in, I also extend this not to just be considerate of people actually, physically taking psychoactive compounds, which I know is, of course, the focus of this conference and a lot of the different momentums in the community right now. But it's also about how the global north is valuing what I call shamanic cognition and really neurodivergent phenomenon of shamanism that has shown up cross-culturally around the world. So we can just actually go through, skip the next slide. It's just an introduction of me. I'm just involved in many different aspects of the psychedelic movement, as Jason introduced me. Here is just the outline of my academic poster that is based off of this research. You guys can go to my website at condormedicine.com to check this out. But we'll just be breaking this down for you. And it's really just taking you through the steps of how we need to be better integrating the transpersonal into the pathology paradigm of the West and how we're actually giving people optimal care when they're having different, psychospiritual, psychological, transpersonal, shamanic phenomenon that's coming forward through their experience with psychoactive compounds and or just naturally through neurodivergence or trauma, which is oftentimes what activates sort of these different transpersonal and cognitive aspects of that we can connect to the mystical states and mystical thinking. So we could go to the next slide, please. So, what is shamanism? I mean, this is something that is a very controversial thing. The word shaman was adopted by early anthropologists and ethnographers, and it's taken from the root origin of Siberian cultures for shaman, which really was utilized to identify this cross-cultural phenomenon outside of Europe. When Europeans left Europe and started colonizing the global South, what's very interesting about the sort of scales of how shamanism expresses itself is that it's oftentimes in what we could consider these like quote unquote primitive, which is what the colonial empires called them, these primitive societies that involve shamans' ability to transcend ordinary reality and to communicate with what we consider spiritual entities. And they serve as this mediator between the human and the supernatural realms. And so these individuals who assume these roles cross-culturally and predominantly in the global South, but of course in India and Siberia as well, they did this through activating this sort of collective unconscious that we all have access to through community ceremony, such as drumming, dancing, fasting, including psychoactive plants, entheogens, but oftentimes too, literally just from their own neurocognition. And that, they're kind of, their brains essentially work like this without taking any substances, let's say. What happened was that individuals were identified and to being able to activate and engage with these transpersonal states of consciousness, to be able to invite in meaning making, cultural cohesion, translation of complex systems of nature. It's hypothesized that most of the information that we have from traditional communities that has, of course, been integrated into commercialized pharmaceuticals in many ways comes from this deeply intimate transpersonal relationship that is deeply shamanic, that is found cross-culturally around the world for thousands of years before the colonial empires left. Um, when Westerners left Europe and they went out to colonize the rest of the planet, this was really this process of using what they saw as shamanic phenomenon in the global South, where they utilized this to devalue and to literally dehumanize most of the other planet, and it really actually encouraged the phenomenon of colonialism as we know it. And of course, we all know, for example, the impact of the Spanish empires in religiosity and how Catholicism came in and was utilized to really spur this development through religious fervor. What's interesting is that when we think about the origins of what we could consider neurotheology, how literally humans are hardwired for religious thinking, that when human development incurs modernization, as we saw in Europe, that the sort of what we specifically link to deep shamanic thinking was sort of evolved out through modernity of Europe to priest and sort of nation state types of ecosystems that are similar but inherently different than shamanic thinking. So including, early anthropologists as the anthropology practices started in the 1800s, going out and actually not just going out with this idea of, oh, let's take over these cultures, but actually studying them, understanding what was going on. The inherent racism that was connected to looking at shamanism is very evident. And so really most recently, beginning in the 50s with individuals like Edgar Schultes, and in particular, a man named Mircea Eliade, who wrote this monumental work that came out in English in 1962, that solidified the cross-cultural phenomenon around the world of shamanism. Eliade was criticized because he was not an anthropologist, but his work, and again, it's like trying to basically combine so many different cultural contexts that, of course, have their own phenomenon, their own practices, their own uniqueness, their own, which has to be valued. Of course, we have to value these things, especially in indigenous communities around the world, but that there is vast similarities in how it's expressed in a variety of ways. And through further anthropological analysis by individuals such as Michael Winkelmann, who has gone very deep into the biosocial phenomenon of shamanism, that it's really been proven that shamanism is a transpersonal, cross-cultural phenomenon that exhibits throughout the West, throughout the planet, including the West. Next slide, please. So I love this, rendition of a painting of, Cortez meeting, the head of the Aztecs, right? Like these shamanic cultures that had completely different valuations and societal norms. And so this is really where this, um, this cultural and sort of energetic conflict has come through, because for thousands of years, the world's primary religious, cultural, and social cultural systems were built on these magical religious frameworks of cultural meaning making and really placebo-based healing that oftentimes integrated this relationship to nature that was through this lens of shamanism. The colonial impacts of what has happened to indigenous people around the world is obviously tremendous. And what we're experiencing right now in the psychedelic renaissance is this very powerful moment where suddenly shamanism, traditional shamanism, if not indigenous people, are really being valued by the global north, not just for their traditional medicines, such as psychoactive compounds and entheogens, but also because of their spiritual practice, their connection to nature, their protection to nature. And what's so interesting is that even though there has been a large cultural construct of really devaluing the aspects of shamanism, that there's always been this phenomenon of oftentimes more elite, wealthier, and oftentimes more white individuals coming from the global north who have always resonated with shamanism. And this is kind of how we understand sort of this neo-shamanistic movement that's happening right now. However, oftentimes it's kind of what can be considered in this phrase of like mashup culture, where people are not necessarily working in these strong, traditional, long-standing cultural containers, but are kind of picking and choosing what they want and mixing it all together and kind of doing their own thing. And this has, complications, especially when we're talking about this integration of suddenly the global north revaluing the addition of psychoactive compounds in this sort of transpersonal thinking and structure. We can go to the next slide. So, the goals for this research for me, and really just putting this out there, starting the conversation, especially with, the academic community, is that I think that we're at this very interesting moment where we have the psychedelic underground that is a vast and tremendous network of individuals that are working illegally in most jurisdictions, may or may not have traditional roots or lineage with them, but maybe there might be some people who are, have certain cultural containers that they're working in. We have globalization that are happening with these compounds right now, as well as these different sort of shamanic practices, et cetera. But what we really need is better integration for individuals that really carries the Western science, Western medicine, Western psychology base of understanding of neuroscience and trauma with what we consider shamanic, paradigmatic, and transpersonal thinking that is pervasive in human consciousness. And this is something that for me, I think is missing from the psychedelic underground for sure. And it's also missing from the academic and more medicalized narrative of psychedelics. So in considering how we are actually creating these stronger cultural containers in the global north to support people, cultural integration, balance, and how we actually are creating safer and more supportive integrated societies using all of the tools that we need. This is why this is so important to bring forward this conversation and how we better integrate this. Next slide, please. So, it's really interesting, like, okay, where did shamanism come from? And this is what's absolutely fascinating about, especially the work of individuals like Michael Winkelmann. When we actually look at how our hominid ancestors, including the vast amount of research on chimpanzees, for example, by well-known individuals like Jane Goodall and others, chimpanzees, who are our closest relatives in nature, that they have these fully shamanic types of spaces that they engage in through drumming, through chanting, through calling, through how they do these different initiatory practices in their communities. This is something that we can really directly relate to. However, what happened with the difference between modern humans and our apely ancestors, our hominid ancestors, was that there was a defined characteristic change in the opioid receptors in our brain, the reward receptors in our brain, as well as the serotonergic receptors of the brain. This is ongoing research that is coming through, but how humans are really hardwired for the transpersonal, and the concepts around neurotheology, and how the actual hardwiring for God and religion is there for humanity. And so why is this? This is something that has allowed humans, it's deeply evolutionary. And so part of this transition that happens with hominid ancestors and even chimpanzee communities is that it's very, very hard, for example, for chimps to be able to actually go into other communities and to go into other groups, for example, to like leave their group and to go out on their own and be accepted by another group. And so what happens is when we have these when humans started to actually actively build culture that was based on shamanic transpersonal states of consciousness, that this in and of itself allowed cultural cohesion, placebo-based healing, translation of nature, but also it allowed people to kind of jump culturally. And it's like, oh, I'm going to sign up for your cultural practice and be able to be initiated. And it allowed people to have ways that hierarchical structures of society actually help support giving people support and meaning in community and culture and a level of protection. So the main difference that we don't necessarily know how to quantify yet is that if chimps themselves are able to actually engage in this full-on mystical, transpersonal, how we describe the mystical experience with like the classic psychedelic experience, right? We don't yet know if that happens, but we do know that there's sort of these other neurocognitive ways that these differences have unfolded between them and between us, and that was part of our evolutionary self. Next slide. Keep drinking water. I'm so dehydrated, y'all. So this is something I just had to throw in there because for those of you who don't know, this is a classic theory that was put out by well-known researcher, psychonaut, activist, original OG member of the psychedelic community, Terence McKenna. And this is the thing too, where when we think about this translation of mystical thinking that is fully embedded in humans from the beginning. Simultaneously, things like psychoactive fungi, psilocybin, which is pervasive in nature and found on everywhere around the planet. That there's something that's so very interesting in how virtually every animal, when you give them psychoactive compounds, they don't want to eat much of it. Like they're not, but humans have been for thousands of years. And so there's and this is proven throughout the historical record. So this is something that Terence McKenna brought forth of that the co-evolved evolution of humans with actively engaging in the transpersonal, including psychoactive compounds, and that this in and of itself could have actually rapidly transformed the very fast, relatively speaking, evolutionary timelines of humanity that we've been on since our hominid selves. I mean, really, like the level of development that we've gone through is unheard of. And sure, it still took a long time, but it's incredibly fast compared to virtually everything else in nature. So this is a highly contested theory, and so and nobody really knows, right? But again, noticing how indigenous people and shamanic phenomenology is pervasive and how it is directly related to us understanding so much more about the wisdom of nature and plant compounds and alkaloids seems likely, right? So, okay, next slide. So how were shamans initially initiated into many different cultures? There's really several ways to get there. Um, Oftentimes children were identified in their youth for having really what we can consider now to be neurodivergent phenomenon. Epilepsy, what we could consider to be autistic traits, levels of clairvoyance and intuition that are really endemic in most neurodivergent communities, like that just children as they would kind of get spotted in from their youth and then would be introduced into different levels of initiation that could take many, generally speaking, take many years, if not decades, until individuals would assume roles in society. There's also another cross-cultural phenomenon of what we consider to be the shamanic call. This is something that has a very particular process to it that Mircea Eliade initially put forth in, again, his monumental book, Shamanism and the Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy, which I cited earlier. This is something where an individual experiences, this period marked by suffering that often includes a literal and or metaphorical death experience, where the individual has what's considered, this sort of ascent to the sky, descent to the underworld, where they're engaging in these transpersonal mystical states of reality, this perception of other dimensionality that is coming through, and then it goes through this next step of having an incredibly difficult time in life where the person has to literally recover and kind of barely makes it through, and then their teachers show up. Individuals have their teachers that show up, or they are incorporated into cultural containers of meaning making that gives them the way to actually utilize their neurocognition for ways that are beneficial for the community, that have checks and balances, and that are also better integrated with the wisdom of elders and other individuals that share the same neurocognitive phenomenon, but in a held cultural container. And so these are these, collection of experiences that how people traditionally got to become shamans that is found pervasively in traditional cultures. And so, okay, we'll go to the next slide. So this is why I'm so passionate about what I do and the really my life that I've been on. Celebrating my 40th birthday yesterday, and 25 years since I had my spinal cord injury when I was 15 years old, which was earlier this month. It's been a big month. But when I was 14 years old, I was a competitive wrestler in high school. I had a precognitive dream that I would become paralyzed in a wrestling competition. 2 weeks later, I actually competed and actually tried to get out of competing that day. This is something that is actually very interesting for individuals who study precognition. And I've actually met many people in my life who've had, these precognitive dreams or information, especially surrounding debilitating injury, accidents, deaths, phenomenon. So this is something that is very, very interesting in sort of the research of neuroscience that's been going on and coming out more. But I had this experience where I broke my neck. I was paralyzed on the wrestling mat during a competition. I left my body. I had an out-of-body experience that was the same as my dream. And in my recovery process, I had less than a 2% chance of ever moving again below my site of injury. And I was in the medical model, and I fully, received surgery. I was in a halo. I was on a ventilator. I was in the hospital for 5 months, and I fully, received the blessing and benefit of Western medicine. And I would also simultaneously go through these deep states of self-hypnosis and placebo healing. There was hundreds, if not thousands, of people praying for me. I had a, very extended community who was very engaged with me, praying for me. Different religious leaders. There's information about this in and of itself, of how their, meditation and prayer and all these things have these effects on healing in these unconscious ways. And my neurophenomenon changed at that time. My neurocognition changed, and And so this is what my story has been, is that my neurocognition changed. I do identify as having a shamanic neurotype, not being a shaman. I grew up in Philadelphia and was raised, with first generation parents. All my grandparents come from other countries, from the Middle East and from Europe, but and we were not in that cultural container. And so this is for me where it's very important for individuals in honoring the traditional people who are connected to shamanic societies, for why it is vital that we honor those cultures and understand the difference between shamanic neurophenomenology and calling ourselves shamans. And so for me, this is the path of how I've led my life and had deep relationships with nature, shamanism. And actually I kind of describe it like my brain works like psychedelics, and I've used psychedelics to be able to understand my own neurophenomenology with my beautiful indigenous teachers that I've been working with for many years. Okay, next slide. So this is kind of back to this place that we're in, with this integration of how we are integrating the transpersonal, how we're integrating shamanic neurophenomenology, neurotheology, especially as all these people are taking psychedelics in the global north and creating better cultural containers and frameworks. Most of the psychological framework of analysis and valuation in the global north is based on what we can consider the pathology paradigm of mental health, as sort of, put forward by the DSM. And this is something that is really problematic because, this is where we've kind of, identified what is normal or typical neurology or ways of thinking about things. And this is the thing that is really complicated because, how do we identify what is healthy neurology or healthy frameworks based on, cultural norms and values, and also, understanding sort of how people's, different neurotypes, neurological phenomenon is working. And this has actually been historically pretty reductionist in how the pathology paradigm has worked. I mean, and it's something that I think is this really exciting moment that we're in right now where we can revalue these things. I mean, the history of the global north, for example, for those of you who don't know, there was such phenomenon as what's considered I could be pronouncing it wrong, but drapetomania in the antebellum South, which was literally trying to pathologize Black enslaved people who wanted to escape to their freedom as being mentally ill, right? For like not wanting to be incarcerated because of their race. So I mean, these are and including things such as homosexuality, right? Queerness. And queerness in and of itself, when we look at shamanic neurophenomenology, something like 75% of individuals who are queer and identify as queer as well tend to be neurodivergent and be sort of held in this encompassment of what neurodivergent phenomenon is. So like outside of this neurotypical norm. And this is something too that, when we're thinking about how to better integrate folks who are neurodivergent into this new psychedelic reality and the paradigmatic thinking of the global north through psychology, Western psychology, this is something we really have to reconsider in how we are understanding mental health and creating safety and support and cultural value for people in this new paradigm, this new neurodiversity paradigm. So next slide, please. This is kind of like my joke / not joke, right? Like this other psychedelic renaissance that we're going through. Suddenly people are valuing taking psychedelics and having mystical thinking, visions, hallucinations, experiences with their ancestors, however you want to call that. But individuals like me who just have that automatically, right? We're pathologized, and we don't have actual strong cultural meaning making in the United States yet, or really most of the global north. And so this is kind of coming back to this phenomenon of what we can consider neurodivergent and neurotypical. Neurotypical is, a person whose neurological development and current state conform to what most people would consider to be quote unquote typical, right? Oftentimes abbreviated as neurotypical. And neurodivergent is a person whose neurological development and current state are viewed as atypical or outside of the norm. Next slide, please. So the neurodiversity paradigm of mental health is where, and this is where, it's the challenge. And I think, but personally think like also the beauty of understanding neurotypes more through kind of dismantling a pathology paradigm in mental health, where people can understand and be empowered to understand better their sensitivities, their challenges integrating with modernity and capitalist society, which we're unfortunately all a part of, and also trying to be able to find community and the challenges that can happen in neurodivergent communities around communication, integration, meaning making, feeling supported. And so I'm a fan of people understanding how their nervous systems work and understanding sort of these different neurocognitive phenomenon based on this neurodiversity paradigm of mental health, and really revaluing and breaking down the stigmas of that. If somebody is autistic, that they have value. If someone has PTSD, they have value, and not like this relentless need to cure, to fix, to change, to stop their neurocognitive phenomenon, because it is. I just turned 40, y'all. I am what I am, and am what I am. And how do I better integrate my neurocognitive phenomenon, the benefits and the challenges of that, into living a full and complete life? And so this is where I see it as this amazing radical moment we're in, with this integration of psychedelic, cognitive thinking, physically taking them, and also like neurophenomena, with these modern times, and it's really exciting. Next slide. I'm gonna have to run through these. Okay. So, what is this proposed shamanic neurotype that I'm putting out there? So, these are, of course, all of us, again, are hardwired for the transpersonal, but I'm really speaking to individuals like me, who have, as I spoke to, that sort of initial ways that individuals who were chosen to be shamanic leaders, we have certain neurophenomenology that expresses itself, and we oftentimes have led our lives in a certain way, that fulfills certain roles in community and meaning making. Um, and so this is, again, like, this is this question I'm putting out to the entire psychedelic medical underground community: is how are we actually creating these better integrated systems? And I'm a big fan of modern medicine and science. I would not be here without it, and I would not be here without having support from really shamanic paradigmatic thinking. And I'll tell you what, when my nervous system really changed during my injury, and it was incredibly hard to integrate how my neurocognitive reality was changing, my mom, of all things, said to me, like, some cultures call this shamanism, and this is actually valued. And I was like, what do you mean? This is a valuable thing? Like, what? I'm going crazy. Like, what? Why is my brain doing this? All these things. And so this is like this very interesting moment. Like, how do we create these new cultural containers in the global north to better integrate these things? It's not this or that. It's not psychotropic drugs or psychedelics, or it's how do we create better models of care for people? So I have it broken down with 3 different pathways to get there. When people are going into psychospiritual crises, or having what we could call, dissociative phenomenon, or like a quote unquote psychotic break that could happen. So next slide, please. So I have this just broken down, and forgive me, y'all, this is just kind of cut out from the model of my academic poster. So I'm just going to walk you guys through sort of 3 different ways that I've experienced after, working with thousands of individuals, working with, who basically have what I would consider neurodivergent phenomenon, if not a shamanic neurotype, and trying to find better integrative care for themselves, working through complex trauma, working through their sensitivities to nature and consciousness and to modernity. And I sort of have this broken down into 3 different ways of the pathology paradigm, of how they value shamanic neurocognitive value, the full sort of more shamanic path, shamanic traditional culture valuation, and how we can kind of be building in that integrated model between those things. So next slide. So this is sort of this pathology paradigm of mental health that oftentimes unfolds. Someone in the global north will have suddenly going into, let's say, a psychospiritual crisis unfolds. So we're going bottom to top. The assessment is made under sort of the modern DSM, and it's diagnosed as being a pathology, as being essentially wrong or bad, or needs to be cured or treated, and not having value, not being culturally relevant or significant, not having anything that we can take from it and be utilizing for it. And the individual is likely to be stabilized with pharmaceutical medication. And again, we don't have time to kind of go through these different sort of origins of what could be associated with this phenomenon, but it could be anything from individuals who exhibit pathology paradigms such as like bipolar disorder, PTSD, a psychospiritual crisis, etc. So it's kind of trying to get to an individual to be stabilized with pharmaceutical drugs and therapy enough to kind of reintegrate back into society, but carrying the stigma that their neurological phenomenon is wrong or bad and does not have value. Next slide. This is the, something that I've seen quite a bit, where individuals, kind of after they stabilize again from these situations, um, they're really having hard times understanding, how to integrate that with the larger culture. There's oftentimes a tremendous amount of shame. There's challenges in integrating with work and, having the ability to work in a capitalist system, which I think is a challenging thing for all of us, but especially people who are neurodivergent, this form of neurodivergence. So, and I think that, but I think so much of, how we need to be supported better, and for individuals who are having mental health challenges, is how they are creating support and meaning making around it. So next slide, please. So this is sort of this traditional, untraditional shamanic path, quote unquote shamanic path, as I just put forward. I just shared my sort of untraditional way of getting there, and spiritual emergence, and then having community integration after a psychospiritual crisis unfolds. So next slide. Next slide, y'all. So the traditional shamanic initiation, like that neurotype shows up, if it's sort of like, the spiritual crisis model, or if it's, sort of that neurodivergent phenomenon when they're a youth. And what happens is that the individual is initiated, they're taken care of, they are given support, they are given, tools to be able to integrate that process with a wider community. And it also has rules and regulations and balance, and a container that it's held in for codes and ethics. This isn't just like do whatever you want, which is what's happening in the psychedelic underground quite a bit. And I find it to be challenging and problematic. And also, of course, it's lots of good things happening in the psychedelic underground too. Don't get me wrong. But again, lots of people working outside of cultural containers. So this is something that we're trying to figure out these ways to better integrate these ways. Next slide, please. So why must the psychedelic revolution better integrate shamanic and transpersonal with the here and now and the all available tools for a healthy community? All right, next slide. This guy, remember him? Um, so, I mean, this is something that for me, the last few years watching COVID unfold, watching, so many individuals, and I've been part of the psychedelic community and working with these things and my own process, et cetera, for decades. But there's more people than ever taking psychedelics. There's more people than ever that, are not educated in scientific method, or don't have the bandwidth to actually do research and actually do all the beautiful research that you all are part of. So, this is this phenomenon that we're starting to see, and here's some terms for people if they don't know about this, but this idea of the woo to the Q, like people who are woo-woo, more spiritual, more in transpersonal community, culture, thinking, etc., but kind of getting into deeply conspirituality types of phenomenon, and really dismantling the the ways that we can actually be better integrating, during this time of peak population, um, peak climate, and peak levels of disinformation. Like, how are we able to actually create better integrative structures for having safety and balance and community cohesion? And so these are the questions. And next slide. So this is how we create this better road, this integrative road for care and also for education of individuals. And this is not to dismantle anyone's spiritual practice, cultural beliefs, any of that, but that in the global north, I think there's a real deficit of understanding science, as I'm sure you guys could all agree with, and also understanding, yeah, I see the head nods, understanding, how the transpersonal works. And so next slide. I know we got to wrap it up here. So this is my ideal, reality that I would love to see unfold in, 10, 20 years as the psychedelic revolution continues to unfold. But how, if psychospiritual crisis unfolds, and we could relate that to any of the pathology paradigms that we want to, as I spoke to, but that, the assessment of how the best care is integrated for this individual is through a community process. It's through indigenous communities. It's through people who have really deep plant medicine wisdom, understand the needs of how to better integrate this person into community structures. And that it's really focused on creating balance, safety, long-term care, and support, but especially meaning making for the individual. How are we creating better meaning for individuals who are navigating complex mental health challenges, and especially with shamanic neurodivergent phenomenon, and creating that support. Next slide. So yeah, this idea of like, and this is what we really need throughout society. Like, why is society ill? Better community care models that are integrative, supportive, giving people all of the tools on the table, um, pharmacological, herbal, adaptogenic, fungal, gut brain access supporting. So we're actually like creating these better integrative care models that are not just this or that, one or the other, good or bad, but how we actually can create better integrative models, which I think is incredibly needed in the global north, especially with the pathology paradigm and the medicalized psychedelic model. Next slide. And thank you so much. It's been great to be here with y'all. And I think we're out of time, but if there's any questions, we have time for that.
Thank you so much, Colette, for your powerful words. We do have a couple questions, but we only have time to ask one. So if you could answer the other two in the chat, that would be excellent.
Got
So the
it.
question we're going to ask is, now that psychedelics are becoming more mainstream in both popular culture and in the realm of Western medicine, what concerns do you have about their future?
Oh man, I have honestly infinite concerns, if I was to be really honest. This is something in and of itself, y'all. Individuals like uh I'm forgetting his first name. There's a book called Neuroqueer Heresies if you guys are interested in understanding neurodivergent phenomenon, especially in queer communities. I'm forgetting his first name, Nick Walker, Nick. When people take psychedelics, it incurs neurodivergent thinking. It incurs increased aspects of neurodivergent phenomenon and outside of our cultural norms. How are we integrating that into the larger realms of society? How are we creating those containers? How are we not seeing people just get lost in the transpersonal? It's something for me that is a challenge for me in my life at times, especially working with traditional people, drinking medicine for so many years, my own neurocognitive process. So that is my biggest concern. And how do we incorporate people in the psychedelic underground and the medicalized narrative for better integrating this? And I think that I would just, yeah, that's the question, and that's really why I think it's really important to have this conversation. And also, yes, give thanks for these medicines and tools.
No, of course.
Yes,
So
give
I wanted to
thanks.
thank you again.
And it's just
We
happening very fast.
No, of course, and that's the dilemma, really. Like, obviously, like the question said, it is becoming so popular throughout society right now, and it's easy to hop on that bandwagon, but you really have to take the steps to really make all the careful considerations of what is safe and effective.
Yeah, I think it just takes
So
time to integrate into community and for ourselves and then the larger community and yeah, and creating more supportive frameworks.
no, exactly. Couldn't have said it any better myself. So, we do really appreciate all your participation, both this year as well as last year. And I wanted to thank you again. Just as a reminder, please fill out the attendance form for this session. Next up, we do have